Hey there, Brian here. Have you ever needed to get out your airbrush to touch up a quick spot you missed, or paint a small part or two, but setting up the big boxy airbrush booth would be a waste of time? So what do? You throw down a piece of paper on your bench and you spray away, only to notice that the overspray is now all over everything. Not to mention, it's probably not the healthiest thing to do. So I went looking for a solution to the problem, but every small footprint paint booth design I found would require you to basically clear your bench before you could do anything. Finally, my inspiration came from a fume extractor used for soldering, but the problem was they're small. They don't move enough air to handle the overspray from a typical airbrush, so those really weren't practical. This idea went through several design iterations, with the primary goal being to be small, but not too small, quick to set up when needed without having to reorganize your life, and easy to put away when not in use without taking up an entire corner of your workshop. Don't get me wrong, that big booth has a purpose. When it's too wet, cold, or windy to use an aerosol can outside, I can set it up to vent out the window and still keep working on what I'm doing. So the idea is basically to create a desktop spray paint or airbrush paint fume extractor. It's not going to be a paint booth. It's just going to be a set it up here and put a paper towel or something down, and then boom, boom, boom. You do your thing, and then you unplug it and set it aside till the next time you need it for something small. The fans I'm using are two 150 cubic feet per minute case fans I robbed out of an old PC, and the sheet material is Sintra, which I'll talk more about in a bit. That'll work. So we'll center this up on here, and the top will be up here, and it'll be facing that way. The position of the fans inside the housing is important. You want them a little lower in the housing than center, because you're going to be spraying sort of down. You want the maximum volume of air coming from sort of in that lower area. Oh, no. That's got to be downsized a little bit. So that we don't want the fans to fall out the other side. So we need a little bit of a lip on the inside of that. So, yeah, that'll work. Sorry, I'm still working on my tutorial skills. I get a little lost in what I'm doing and forget to, describe what's going on. The material I'm using here is called Sintra, S-I-N-T-R-A. It's expanded PVC, similar to styrene or foam core, but more durable. I came across a big stash of this stuff and stocked up on it, so I'll be using it in a lot of projects. But this one can be made from just about any sheet material, including cardboard, although I would probably avoid the foam core. It would be a little flimsy. It cuts similar to styrene in that you can score it a few times and then break it off. Yep. But you'll need to clean up your edges. So there. So we've got the hole cut, and a little bit of a lip so that it doesn't fall through. That's good. Alright, so now we're going to build a box around the outside of that to hold everything in. And the box, we're going to use the fans themselves as the guide on where to make it. That way you don't have to worry about, measuring too much stuff. As I mentioned, the fans I'm using are out of an old computer, and they're 4 3/4 inches by 4 3/4 inches by 1.5 inches. So we're looking at like 300 cubic feet per minute going through an opening that's 9 inches by 4 3/4 inches. I think the fan in my big cardboard booth is only somewhere around 500 cubic feet per minute, maybe a little more. So once this thing's going, it's going to be quite powerful. As I was researching the best way to fasten or glue two pieces of this Sintra together, sort of the internet consensus, if you will, seemed to be CA glue, and I must say it is quite a strong bond. Once it's there, it's really not going to want to come apart. I was going to use a gel super glue, but I got to thinking, and that would be a big mess on a project this large and as much as I needed to use. So I opted with the medium and just took one of the applicator tips from the thin and just cut it down to where it would make a good applicator. At that point, I was able to precisely control how much glue and where it went. When you've got the frame glued up that goes around the fans, you're ready to glue that to the plate. But you want to be careful because you need to make certain that the hole is centered inside the frame. That way the fans will sit in there correctly and they won't fall through. I had considered gluing the fans into the frame, but then I thought better of it. In case I ever wanted to rebuild this thing, I would want to be able to get the fans out of it without, destroying them. So I opted for these little corner wedges that would just sort of set around the edges and hold it in. I really wasn't wild about the way they looked when I got done, so if I had it to do over again, I think I would probably take a smaller, thinner little strip and just glued it around the edges like a little picture frame. So now we can get started on the business end of this thing. I'm going to call it an air chamber. It's the space between the back of the filter and the front of the fan. This is where it spreads out the force of the air moving through it, so it covers a broader area. It makes it more like an air filter, which it is, and less like a vacuum cleaner, which it is not. In fact, this thing can be used as an air filter for sanding or anything that you're doing that creates dust. That said, it should never replace a respirator when one is called for. Okay. Now that we've got the basic structure built, we need to, I like to tilt back a little bit, but it needs to stand up straight if it's going to catch the majority of the stuff. So, we've got the filter. And then there'll be a frame that goes over top of it that holds it all in place. So, but you've got to make certain you've got enough space in the frame. It's got to have a little bit of gap around the edges so that it will fit over it and not tear the filters. The filter itself is just some cheap furnace filters I picked up at the hardware store and then cut them up. I then folded it over a couple times and checked it with some calipers to see how thick it was so that I knew the clearance I needed around the outer frame. Gluing up the frame, you want to make certain that everything's at 90 degrees. So you want to grab something that is first 90 degrees and second won't get stuck with the super glue. I don't remember where I came up with these little metal blocks I'm using, but since I keep a light coat of oil on them, the glue doesn't stick to them very well. After trimming the filter to fit, I cut and glued a support on the back so the thing would sit level. Alright, moment of truth. Oh yeah. And we just need to clean up the back. For the electrical plug, I robbed it out of an old router and just soldered it onto the ends. And I'm sorry I didn't video that part, but I wanted to make sure that the thing worked before I really committed to building it and got a little ahead of myself. Speaking of getting a little ahead of yourself, I was testing to see if I could cut a square hole in this material, and it did such a good job I went ahead and just used that piece of material that I was doing the test on and glued the plug into it before I even had the thing cut to size. Given how I plan on using this thing, I decided against putting a switch on it since it's not going to be hardwired to a power source. The switch is the plugs. You just plug it in when you need it and unplug it when you don't. As I mentioned earlier, this thing, it's got some power to it, but it is not meant to replace a respirator. The purpose of a respirator is not just dust. There are volatile organic compounds in especially spray paint, like rattle can spray paint, or in certain enamels that really shouldn't get into you. You want to keep those out as much as possible. Before we get any further, yes, it still works. I think not bad for the first try. Now I need something to paint. I primarily work in acrylic, so the fumes is not the problem for the stuff I do. It's the pigment. You don't want that pigment airborne. It's made up of just little tiny pieces of acrylic plastic that will not just go all over everything. It will also get in you, and we don't want that, do we? So I don't really have a set of measured drawings for this thing. I like it. The size of it is going to be based on what you have available to you. The fans I had were 120 millimeter standard case fans at, again, 150 cubic feet per minute for each one. But they've come in various sizes, and you can set them up into an array of either 2 or 3 or even 4 fans, depending on the size of filtration that you need. A couple rules of thumb, though, is whatever your size opening is for your fans, you want to make that surface area about double for the filter. Also, this was sort of a design it as I go project, so if you see something that you think would make it better, say so down in the comments, and maybe we'll build a 2.0 version. Also, if you found any of this the least bit helpful, I would really appreciate you hitting the like button, and maybe even consider subscribing, because I'm going to be doing more of these things. I think I've already got the next project in mind, and you're not going to want to miss it. All right? Oh, and check out this video here. YouTube thinks you'll like it. Thanks again, and go make something.